session. So if you don't want to be recorded, please turn off your video cameras and microphones, but otherwise. So let's get started. Let me share my screen. And then we can get started. So hopefully everybody can see that shared screen now. First of all, a huge welcome to everybody. Thank you. This is an incredible number of people turning up. So thanks for taking the time to join today. As I said, we are recording the session, so we'll be publishing a link to this session afterwards, including the Q&A at the end as well. So bear in mind that we'll continue recording at the end, because it's often the case that there's really good content that follows in the Q&A afterwards. So thanks again for everyone for joining. A quick agenda for today. The format is going to be a bit rough, as all sort of community calls are, and all things starting out are, until we actually sort of work out the right format of things. So please bear with us. This is probably going to be a bit heavier in terms of project updates today than future community calls. So again, please bear with us on that. What we'd like to do in future calls, as I'll explain in a minute, is actually have more community involvement in the call itself. But sort of necessarily, this being the first community call, there's going to be a bit more of an update on the project itself. So please bear with us on that. So we're going to also review recent progress, talk about upcoming Q releases, some introduction to full-time Q contributors, talk about priorities for the rest of the year, some announcements and plans for future calls. Ideally, the call will last around 50 minutes, followed by open Q&A at the end. So please feel free to ask questions as we go. If it makes sense to deal with those questions as we go, we'll take them. Otherwise, we might just postpone them until the end, if that's okay. So thinking about how community calls will work, really the goal with community calls is to think about how we can improve communication with and within the Q community. A large part of that focus is really to better share what we are solving for, i.e. priorities with the project, and really then make sure there's alignment with the community on that. Understand how we can do things better as well. But as I said, a main focus also needs to be sharing interesting use cases for Q, progress and stories from other Q users. So there's good like cross-fertilization, if you like, within the community. So as I said, the future community calls will follow a similar sort of agenda, but there will be more of a focus on the actual Q things that are happening within the Q community. So you can see this agenda, as we will have a future community calls, is very similar to the agenda we looked at today, but there's going to be more of a focus on the community. And this spotlight on section will be exactly that, where we take one or two existing people, projects or companies that are using Q, and focusing on them for one of the calls. So we'll talk a bit about who we're having as our spotlight for the next community call towards the end of this community call. And then at the end, we will always follow with Q&A/office hours. And if there's actually more demand for having more sort of open Q&A office hours, we're really open to doing that as well. So let's just talk a bit about the project focus right now. Incidentally, if people need to interrupt me, Marcel and others, please just do, because I'm not looking at the messages as they're coming in. So just looking at the Q project focus right now. If we think about the current focus and work we've just been recent progress, we've actually sort of grouped that thematically into 4 areas. So that everything that we're going to talk about in terms of either a current focus or a future focus can really be tagged with one of these categories here. So existing users, that is existing users of Q, obviously. New users, similarly, new users of Q. V1, and we'll talk about what V1 is in a second. And docs and content. And so by docs and content, we mean absolutely everything to do with docs and content for Q itself as a project. Now, there's clearly quite a lot of overlap between these categories here. For example, new users and docs content, there's a lot of overlap between them, but they are separate and distinct in some ways. And so we're just using these as themes effectively to group what it is we're currently working on and what we will be working on. So it's actually possible to sort of tell stories in terms of these themes as well. So for example, it could be that for existing users of Q, you might have trouble finding reference content. So that would therefore be existing users and docs content. And so the things we're focusing on, we tend to categorize in this way because it actually helps us tell stories in terms of who it is we're referring to in any given situation. So briefly, what do we mean by V1? We're not going to talk about this in a great deal of detail here. Indeed, we could do this in a later session, so please let us know if you would like that. Q has sort of a lot of heritage, if you like, from the Go programming language, and Go has a V1 compatibility guarantee. So like Go, we're looking to get to a language backwards compatibility guarantee. And similar to Go, we're also looking to have an API compatibility guarantee as well. Now, these won't necessarily happen at the same time. But the language compatibility guarantee is the main focus in order that people who are writing Q, once we hit that V1, will be sure that actually we won't then make any breaking changes to the language that would then break any Q that they have written at that point in time. And similarly, we're looking to move towards tooling stability as well. But there is no such compatibility guarantee for Go's tooling. We might do something for Q, but that's still to be defined at this point in time. So this is what we mean by talking about V1. It's basically reaching some point of stability, either from a language, API, or tooling perspective. So it's now worth just talking about what breaking changes remain from the language. So required fields is one of those such breaking change, and we talk about second version of the required fields proposal that has been announced recently. Making lists open by default is another such change. Standardization on field ordering within Q. And just briefly, before I talk through this entire list here, what we're going to do afterwards is ensure that there is a separate announcement in the GitHub discussion for this community call, which links to each of these issues. Rather than cluttering the slide with issue numbers, we'll provide a sort of comprehensive list of links afterwards, or maybe even share the slide deck and link directly from these items. So if I'm not shouting out issue numbers, that's why. It's just to keep it a bit shorter. A critical bug fix, which is not allowing new definitions within closed structs. That's something that is allowed but shouldn't be. Some mode by which you can opt into the parent directory model, which is something that people might be familiar with from the Kubernetes tutorial, instead of the default whereby it is currently on at the moment. In revisiting the relationship between int, float, and number. Using tilde instead of tilde equals for regular expressions. These are things, both of the last two there are things that were actually fairly early on in Q were mooted as possible changes that could be made. We just have been gathering experience on what that actually looks like. And we haven't even committed to making those changes yet, but might well do. Removing deprecated APIs. As we're making changes in the Go API, we're looking to tidy that up again with a view to getting to a V1 of the Go API. And as we have been trying, as Marcel has been trying right from day one, is to actually, wherever there are breaking changes within the language, to make those as automated as possible. So Qfix for any changes that can be fixed automatically within Q code. Even looking towards Go changes where we change the Go API, helping people with those as well. And actually making the sort of migration story better by actually using a Q version or a Q directive in the module file, like the Go directive in the go.mod file as exists today. So that story of compatibility is something we're working on for V1 as well. So looking at upcoming releases, there's been quite a large gap since the last release. 0.4.3 was, I think, back in April. And the 0.5.0 is quite unusual in that there's a very large amount in there, particularly from like a reworking perspective. So as you can see here, we've got a reworking of comprehensions, cycle algorithm, and let expressions. Now, this has actually required a huge amount of work. And we're not quite there with v0.5.0. So just to say that v0.5.0 is unusual in its size and the gap since the previous release. But that's because there are effectively a number of intertwined things that have led to us getting to this point of, okay, we need to bring all of these three in together. Also implemented self-contained imports, which Kubevela have been using as part of their project. numerous bug fixes, and I'm not going to list those. The release notes for the pre-releases for v0.5.0 will go into those in more detail. And just briefly to flag that we also have a Q.selector API as well. Looking ahead to the next releases, reworking of disjunctions, various performance issues, whether they relate to disjunctions or not. Required fields, as we mentioned about, there's a proposal out at the moment around required fields, and we'll talk about that later. Modules, and the critical bug fix that I talked about to flag is that there's a definition in closed structs bug fix. Now, the only reason to point that one out is that some releases might actually be very, very small and have a single change as part of them, where that is a breaking change. And that's just really to ease the upgrade path for some people. So that way, if they realize that they upgrade to that later version that has got that bug fix in and it breaks them, they can just stay on the previous version and not be worried about missing out on anything else that would be contained in that release. So we'll be very dynamic with our releases. We're not going to have a fixed release schedule. We're not at a point of stability yet whereby we can say, oh, we will only do releases twice a year. As I said, it's unusual that 0.5.0 has got so much in it, but we will be quite a bit more dynamic with future releases. So let's take a look at what we've been focusing on recently. As I said, it's grouped by those 4 categories: existing users, new users, docs, content, and V1. And so everything we look at now is really sort of categorized here to sort of help give a bit of a heat map, if you like, for where we've been focusing. So the largest sort of part of our effort really has been in preparation for v0.5.0. With all the reworking of comprehensions, let, and the cycle algorithm, that's really mainly a focus for existing users, where there are critical bugs, for example, within any of those aspects there. But clearly, it's moving us towards V1 as well. Onboarding of new full-time Q contributors, we'll see and hear from them in a bit. Really, that's sort of all categories, because it's helping to increase the velocity of the project. Required field proposal, as I mentioned before. Function signature proposal, which we won't go into detail today, but we could do a future session on. The Go support policy, again, we'll reference a link to that later. A major one here is the qlang.org redesign and content reworking. Docs and content is something that we hear a lot about in terms of being like an issue for new users in particular, but also existing users. And so that is necessarily sort of a key part of our focus recently, and will be in the future as well. Unity private repository support. Briefly, Unity is a system whereby we can regression test against a large code base. And because we don't have a huge amount of Q ourselves, we're actually asking community projects to actually register their projects with us, and then we can regression test against that from like a correctness perspective, but also a performance perspective. We've also been helping focus on Qvela v0.2.2 upgrade issues. The Qvela project, we're a bit stuck on v0.2.2. We're helping unblock them, getting them up to a more recent release of Q. That way, they can be more responsive to changes that we are making in later releases. And we want the same of everybody. Basically, we don't want people lagging behind on old versions. We want to help people stay as up to date as possible. Excuse me. We've also been investigating some fairly significant tools flow performance problems raised by Dagger, Cascade, and others. Tools flow is a slightly trickier one in that perspective, in that respect, and sort of coupled with evaluation performance problems as well, it can sort of combine to give some fairly interesting characteristics there. We also gave a recent presentation to London Gophers talking about how to use Q and Go together from like a validation of configuration perspective. And we're also we've also been improving our issue management process. So as the number of folks working full time on Q is increasing, we now just have a better capacity to look at issues, and we're trying to get on top of issues as they're being created as well, which, as the number of Q users increases, it is likely to increase as well. So now switching to look at priorities for the rest of 2022, what we're going to do is we're actually going to have we're going to cycle through those people who are working full time on Q. They're going to give a brief introduction to themselves and talk about what it is they are working on for the rest of 2022. So with that, I will hand over to Marcel.
Yeah, hey, so I see a lot of familiar faces here on the call, so I'm sure I don't know everybody yet, but most of you will know I'm the creator of Q. Started really as a Google project many years ago to sort of redeem myself on the errors I made with GCL, which was configuration language made as part of the Borg project, which is a precursor to Kubernetes. So then I did many things at Google, but another thing that might be relevant for the Q project is that I was on the Go team for a pretty decent stint, almost 10 years, I think. So next slide. Yeah, so what my priorities are for the rest of the year. So the first thing is to release the comprehension and cycle redo. So really, this is a precursor to being able to do a lot of different things in Q. It not only tightens down the semantics for comprehensions and basically makes the cycle algorithm much more comprehensible. So it allows me to crank and fix bugs much quicker. I think Stephen has noticed that recently. That's some very complicated bugs could be solved very quickly, whereas normally this would have taken forever. So the next step is to start tackling the disjunction bugs. So the biggest problem with disjunction, there's a few like very bad bugs there, but the biggest problem really is that this is one of the major reasons why Q is slow. So right now it has exponential behavior, even though it should be polynomial for extreme cases, and for any normal case like disjunctions that you would encounter in protobus or Kubernetes, it would really be linear. So that would be a huge reduction in running time. I know what the problem is. We know how to solve it. Funnily enough, it's actually the required fields proposal, and the implementation of that is a big step towards that, strangely enough. So other performance issues, so like the tools flow. So this is related to a few properties of Q and flow combined, causing also quadratic behavior. This is partly the way it should be, but there are some optimizations that in the 99% of the cases would reduce it to linear. So this would be nice to work together. So in order to do that, we have to work together with concrete examples. So for example, Joel, that might be a good thing to work with Dagger to really see like, okay, how can we, like where exactly are the use cases and boundaries? But in the vast majority of cases, this should be able to make it linear. So then another really important thing, I think, is the language guide. So really, if you look at Q documentation, how it's written now, it's a little bit akin to saying like, yeah, Go is a really nice and easy to use language because it uses garbage collection. Let us now explain how the garbage collector works, right? Like that is not really the way you should write it. So really the way I see it is that Q has more or less the complexity of a spreadsheet, right? Like an advanced use of spreadsheets. So the language should also reflect that. So no mention of lattices and unification. It's really not necessary. Yeah, so another thing that we've been doing is rather than like fixing random bugs and basically have everybody wait until all the bugs they need are fixed, is to sort of focus on some key users and look at it more holistically and unblock people one at a time. So just to make sure that the bugs are cohesive and that we make sure that big users are making real progress. So let me see. So yeah, so I hope that answers Judson's question also. So structure sharing, seconds to compiling. So seconds to compiling, like in theory, Q really should, like even a large configuration should be able to run in milliseconds. We've had, in my experience with graph unification, when I worked at it during my research time, we went from minutes runtime to milliseconds runtime on the same hardware. And there's nothing, some things different about Q, but really there shouldn't be any difference. It should be able to run really fast. It just takes time to get to that point. Structure sharing, as you've noticed, I've not mentioned that yet. So specifically, so the comprehension and cycle redo, Specifically, our big, and also the field required fields proposal, what's necessary for that are a big step towards structure sharing as well. But one thing, so structure sharing will give such a performance boost that it might actually hide other performance issues. I'm a little bit reluctant to do it now. I'd rather fix like the other performance issues and then, so we'll double down with the structure sharing. So that's a little bit why I'm a little bit reluctant to do that as of now, but it will hopefully be soon. That's it for me. So on to Paul.
Thank you. I should say that on the performance side of things, this is actually a really good use case for Unity. So if folks do have large Q code bases that they may need to share privately with us, that's something we're working on. We'll talk about that in a second. Unity is also a way of us just validating that we have correctness of Q as well. So from a performance perspective, we're also going to look to analyze that within Unity as well.
Oh yeah, Paul, one more thing there. So one thing that will be in 0.5, at least partially implemented, is to gather in the API like statistics about unification. So rather than measuring performance in runtime, it actually measures performance in terms of counts. And because everything is basically unification and Q under the hood, we have it's quite easy to measure performance in terms of a few simple counts, and that's actually very effective. So it allows us to catch performance issues even on very small pieces of Q code and running on different architectures. It will be immediately visible. So the idea is to also put that into the unit test so that we can immediately notice if even very pieces of small specific Q start deviating performance-wise.
Cool. Thanks, Marcel. Brief introduction to myself. My name is Paul Jolly. I did software engineering and product at GoCardless many moons ago, at Goldman Sachs, excuse me, many moons ago. Then actually also spent some time at GoCardless doing software engineering as well. They're a startup based in London. I've contributed to the Go open source project especially on the tooling side of things, and built a site called playwithgo.dev with sponsorship from the Go team to help with interactive tooling-based learning for Go. And I'm mildly obsessed with financial or just modeling in Q generally, having previously attempted to build a modeling company, a financial modeling platform prior to working on Q full-time. But Q is an even better fit from that, so hence why I'm working on Q full-time now. And my priorities for the rest of 2022, similar to Marcel, really helping to unblock Q users. And really, this is largely a function of the issue management side of it as well. So making sure that as issues are being created, we understand what they are to start with, that we have reproducers for them, they're categorized correctly, so that then as we're turning the handle on fixing these things in certain categories, we're actually working through the number of issues as well. Carmen's going to talk a bit more about the content side of things, but helping to implement an actual pipeline from an engineering perspective on the content side of things to make sure we have things like CI testing for our content, but also that we've got a nice, pipeline from I'm writing my article here to it actually being published as well. An initial LSP implementation. This has long been something we talked about, but now we're actually moving around to working on. This will leverage work for existing LSPs, which include Dagger's LSP, but also GoPlease as well. There's been a lot of improvements to GoPlease over the last 6 months that actually help in terms of making that less Go specific, and that there's more sort of a general framework that we can use there on the GoPlease side, and then put in the Q specific part within it. But also looking, as I said, at what Dagger have done as well. Running community calls, that's an important part and community calls and related calls, I should say, for existing users and new users. And finally, I'll be helping to create content for qlang.org as well. Whatever we decide, we'll be focusing on there. So with that, I will hand over to Carmen.
Hello, everyone. Some of you might know me from the Go ecosystem. I was on the Go team with Marcel at Google, and I led the learning ecosystem and the open source strategy efforts there, which has also included some of the sponsorship things that Paul included. I saw an early demo of Q about almost 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, and having just come from the build infrastructure team at Travis CI, I was floored by Q's potential for so many things. The light bulb went off on what was missing from the CI/CD or the IAC, the infrastructure as code, or the GitOps stack, so to speak. And so I'm thrilled to devote all of my time to Q now. In addition to the Go team, I also led the cloud native open source strategy and the developer experience open source strategy teams in Google Cloud. So next slide. I will be focusing on Q documentation and content efforts, which encompass qlang.org and the wider ecosystem of docs and content. So all the creators that are out there, we want to help support and empower that emergent ecosystem, and we want to ensure that qlang.org helps in the discovery of all that as well. So this is going to help with onboarding and learning a wide variety of use cases and the user needs that Q has, with a goal to widespread adoption. A large part of that is, of course, continuously working with the various corners of the open source ecosystem within Q and anything that's going to be an integrator, and doing continuous user research. So that's what I will be focusing on for the rest of the year, and I will pass it over to Roger.
Hello, yeah, I'm Roger Pepe. So I come from a background of, I got into Go very early on, which led me to Canonical, and I did a bunch of stuff there. I did a tool called Juju and various other things, and I was quite involved in the Go community as well, contributing to the language early on and various other things. If you ever see the error keyword, that was my suggestion, which is. And then you know, quite a lot later on, I encountered Q, and I was like, actually, this is an amazing technology, and used it for various things, just like managing large test suites, some API compatibility stuff, various other things, and made me more convinced that it was a very interesting and useful tool. So I've been very happy to join to start working full time on Q now, yeah, next slide, please. So my main focus over the next while, there's a lot to do, is modules, because that's a very big and necessary thing. And I think that in general, we are going to, like, the Go, you know, obviously lots of us have background in Go, but actually we think that it's a very good template. They've thought very hard about the way that modules work, and that we're probably largely going to follow Go's lead in that, in the detail of much of the proposal. There are various things which I think we can do slightly differently, because there are, like, there's in some areas of, for example, more fine-grained compatibility, where you want to keep some things less compatible than the whole module, and also there's areas where you might want to co-version your Q with some other in some other source code system, and that's another. But I think largely those are orthogonal, or at least additional to the Go modules, and we can do a lot just by having some vanilla modules support. So that's a big thing. So yeah, as part of that, we've got various Q commands like qget, qmod, qlist. And additionally to that, I've also been looking at the function signatures proposal. And an initial motivation for that was just to be able to describe the functions in the standard library as normal Q, because at the moment it's kind of weird that anyone who looks at the Q standard library actually has to look at a Go function signature and try and work out what that means in Q. I mean, that's weird in a bunch of ways. But actually, there are, I think that it has a lot of potential to for function signatures to become like a kind of gateway between Q and the outside world of potentially effects or other more plug-in type things, so that Q becomes more of a kind of extensible language in that way. So that's all. A lot of that is to be thrashed out. We have some initial ideas, but it's still very much in fast iteration mode. And obviously there's lots of docs and stuff to be helped with, so I'm going to be helping with that too. Daniel?
Cool. So my name is Daniel Marty. Before I got into Go about 7 years ago, I was very much into open source. So I was part of some projects like F-Droid. And in Go, I've contributed in a number of ways. On the code side, I've helped maintain packages like JSON template and also GoFont itself. I've also helped the community by running a few contributor workshops in London, for example, meetups. I run the local Sheffield meetup. And also, we have recurring monthly Golang tools calls. That is a nice interface between the Go project and people who closely integrate with parts of it, like modules. So I think of this call, for example, as a nice follow-up from what's worked well in the Go tools ecosystem. And I've also authored a number of Go tools. You can think of areas like static analysis, formatting, but also obfuscation, just because nerd snipes work very well sometimes. And on to what I'm going to be focusing on. It's basically going to be Unity. And as a TLDR for what Unity is, in case you're not aware, it's essentially regression tests that integrate third-party code bases into our CI. So whenever we test a new change in our CI, not only does it run against all of our tests, it also runs against a bunch of third-party tests, and that helps us flag when things are unexpectedly going to break a third-party user that we care about, or that is has lots of Q configs, for example. But Unity has a number of limitations today, and I'm going to be lifting those. And the main one being that we don't support private code bases, private third-party code bases in Unity. Another one is that we don't support running Go tests. So right now we only support running Q commands. So there's no testing of how people use the Q Go APIs. We also want to add at least a few more users to Unity in terms of increasing the coverage and ideally the variety of what people are doing with Q. And finally, I'm going to do my little bit towards the content for the QLang.org site. And that is it for me. And I believe Ram is next.
Hello, I'm Aram Havarnianu. I discovered Go literally the day it was publicly released, and I've been a fan ever since. And I've contributed various things to Go. For example, I wrote the ARM64 port and the Solaris port. Just like Roger, actually, we worked together at Canonical because we were part of the few people in the community who are interested in Go. So yeah, that was great. I come from a more theoretical side of things, so I'm interested in any kind of language and formal semantics in general. So I found Q again very early, and I was very interested in its theoretical properties. But by playing with it, I very quickly found out that it's actually useful to also solve like practical problems that I was having with cloud configuration and things like that. So then I became really interested in Q. Next slide, please. Yeah, now with Q, I will first concentrate on Roger earlier said about the function proposal. Yeah, we plan to give people the power to write functions in their favorite programming language and expose those functions to Q to be able to call from Q. So rather than extend Q itself to have user-defined function, let people write them in whatever language they have. And we plan to use WebAssembly for this because it gives us several advantages. One of them being the fact that we could enforce sandboxing, because we do not want to break any. Like right now, Q you can run Q eval, and it's not going to break your system or do any kind of effects that you don't expect. So we want to preserve this property even with user-defined functions. But then again, we also want to give people the power to write the effectful functions in Q, and how exactly we're going to do that is still an open question, but it's definitely related to the function signature proposal. Apart from WebAssembly, I'll also be working on writing denotational semantics for Q, which not only would give us lots of confidence in our implementation, but I think it would allow us to explore ideas more fluently and play with ideas. And it's also a goal of mine to be able to use the denotational semantics then to generate tests automatically, not just for Q itself, but maybe also for users of Q. Again, this is pretty open-ended, and it's just like we're just in an exploratory phase right now. But this what I'm working on, and I think I'll hand it over to Dominic.
Thank you, Ron. I'm Dominic. I'm doing project ops at the Q project. Before that, I always worked with like new ventures, mainly on growth. So basically, from the idea on the post-it to like sustainable organization operations. So I like to be things when it starts at the beginning. I have a background in business innovation, so it's always like the link between technology and organizations, operations, and also project management, for example. So next slide, please. So as said, my goal for the year, or the priority for the year, is project ops. I basically understand it in a way that's everything that is not code but crucial for the development of the Q project. I think it is a very ambitious project right now, and even at this quite early stage, there's a lot of organizational and operational boilerplate, and I see it as my job to help with that everyone else can also focus on their priorities. I think it's also important there. This is like not a priority for the rest of 2022, but it's like a continuous increasing effort, and I'm looking forward to being focused on that. I'm also focused on user research. I think there are lots of users, different groups already using Q, but the potential is there are lots of potential users that have similar problems that could be solved with Q, that they're out there and really want to understand how to support them, what they need. And I think the idea is that the more people use Q, the more contributor we have. And I also want to support the team in the creation of content for Q9.org. And I think that the quote below said by Carmen really describes it quite well. It's like behind every great maintainer is another maintainer that helps with all the project ops. And I see myself in that role. And now I'm handing the mic back to Paul.
Epic. Thanks, everybody, for introducing yourselves. So now you have a bit of a better idea of those folks who are working full-time on the Q project. Just to look slightly further ahead beyond the end of this year, because there may be things that you were hoping for us to talk about in terms of our focus before the end of the year, but that weren't there. Just to say that we haven't forgotten them. The query proposal is perhaps one of the more common and sought after ones. That sort of necessarily will come after the things we're focusing on next. But there's also some of the details of that we need to work through. It's not that the proposal is final in any way, shape, or form yet. Some sorts of support for embedding. Again, we need to define what that exactly looks like. And again, probably do so in the context of the package management proposal that Roger referred to earlier on as well. Support for more and complete encodings adapters. So Q has the ability to act as an interlingua for either data or schema formats, JSON being a good one, YAML being another. But JSON schema, that we only have one-way support for that at the moment. So it would be to not only add two-way support for that, but to add other either data or schema encodings or adapters. Better error handling is another one that has been talked about in the past. We're sort of chipping away at error handling. It's not to say that we're ignoring it, but I think there's some more systematic approaches we can take to especially user-defined errors that we've talked about in the past that we will look to revisit at some point. Adding more Q commands, or I've got to say this the right way around, adding more commands to command Q, whether that be something like Qtest, for example, or Qdiff, or replacing Q command, I always get this wrong, Q command with something like Qrun, so that we then don't have the ambiguity as to what I'm actually referring to. More core built-ins. Some of these will actually be implemented along the way with things like required fields, but these would allow us to remove, for example, the use of the bottom symbol and make other things like one-offs much easier to implement as well. And integrations with other languages. Aram referred to the WASM interaction. We also are aware that people want to use Q in sort of a different environment. So they say, well, it's like a multilingual environment where they have, well, a situation where a service is written in Ruby, for example, and they want to actually validate some sort of payload using Q from within Ruby. And so we're aware of that. That's not a focus right now, but is something that is on the horizon. But again, with any of these things, if there are sort of large use cases or specific priorities that we're not aware of, please flag them to us so that we can sort of look at that and sort of help to adjust what it is that we are prioritized, what it is we are prioritizing. So moving beyond this, and if you'll allow me, I'll keep going and we'll just get to the end of this and then we can wrap up with a Q&A at the end. I've seen lots of questions coming in, so thank you for raising those. And just briefly to talk about some announcements. Firstly, from a sort of process perspective, we're primarily going to use GitHub discussions as our means of announcing things. There are two categories there, announcements and proposals, that we will use. That feels like the most consistent place to post things for now. And we will then cross-post to Slack, Twitter, wherever else. So there is in fact no good way of actually subscribing to only announcements or proposals. So what we will try and do is to make our posting to things like Slack and Twitter consistent so that folks can then just go and subscribe to them and keep up to date on them. On that topic, when we are, so for example, any of the focus points that we talked about for the end of this year, what we'll be doing is creating umbrella issues. So let's just take the WASM integration as one such example. Aram will be creating an umbrella issue that people can subscribe to, and then other issues off that. So people can follow the fact that, oh, great, Aram's doing this work with WASM, let me subscribe to that issue, and then you can be kept up to date on all the WASM-related news by subscribing to that one issue. So after this community call, we'll actually share, as I said, links to those umbrella issues as well as any other issues, so you can subscribe to whatever you need to. Two announcements that I told you about earlier on. The required fields proposal version 2 has been released. That is GitHub discussion 1951. It's the same in some respects, but markedly different in others to the original version of the required fields proposal. Please, we'd love feedback on that. It reads much more easily than the first version, and we're much more comfortable with where it's at this time around based on feedback that people have provided. So thank you to those who engaged on that last time. We'd love to get feedback on this second version right now. A Go release policy 1937 is something that, again, this is a GitHub discussion. This is really asking the question, what releases of Go should we support as the Q project? So from your perspective as a consumer of Q, what dependencies do you have? So if we were to drop support for Go 117 today and start using features in Go 118 and above, does that present a problem for you? If so, please jump into that discussion and let us know. A couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk at London Gophers that talked about how Go and Q can be combined to make a match made in heaven, as I described it. This uses an experimental new package, QConfig, as just a demonstration of how it's easy to write or adapt an existing Go program that consumes, say, JSON to consume Q instead, and the benefits you can get from that. Here, it links to the actual YouTube video, but we'll also be making available the slides, but also an interactive tutorial that follows through the same example as well. Some news of some upcoming conferences that we'll be at. We're traveling to North America at the end of this month, where we'll be at, I've got to be careful the way I say this, the letter Q con here and not CUE con. This is going to get incredibly confusing. And if it looks like we're going to be at both of these conferences at the same time, we are. So we will all be in San Francisco at the start of that week. And then Carmen and I will go to KubeCon, K-U-B-E con, for the latter part of the week. And if we're not all thoroughly confused with how those names sound or should be pronounced by the end of the week, then that'll be a miracle. So please, if you're going to either of those two conferences, let us know. It'd be lovely to see you there, please. We're not doing, Marcel's giving a talk at QCon, but otherwise we'll just be floating around in the hallway track. So now just briefly to talk about future community calls. The next call will be on Tuesday, the 25th of October. So that will be live from KubeCon, KUBE. And we will have a spotlight on Tony Worm. Now, Tony has been someone who has long been a member of the Q community and a prolific contributor to not only the GitHub, the Q GitHub repository, whether it be issues, discussions, but also the Slack repository, creator of Qtutorials as well. And Tony is also has his own project that he's working on called Hoff. So we're going to be talking to Tony about Q, why he likes Q, what his views on things are. So please look forward to that next time. As I said, we'll be doing that from KubeCon. Carmen, I'll hand over to you if that's okay for this slide. Sorry,
Sure.
not announced.
Yeah, no problem at all. We just are announcing that we're scheduling another call next Tuesday, same time, to discuss documentation and content, where we are, where we want to go, how we need your help. And so I welcome for you, anybody who's here, to spread the word. And please see the issue 1964 in the QLang namespace on GitHub to learn more. It is a placeholder issue, and the agenda will be added ad hoc. But if you have specific concerns, please add to that discussion now, and we can make sure that those concerns are addressed in 1 week's time.
Thanks, Carmen. Yeah, the best way, as I said, this is like one of those umbrella issues. It's actually a discussion in this situation. If you click through to that, it'll take you to a discussion, not an issue. But you can subscribe to it. And so then any updates that Carmen posts to that, for example, with the joining details for the call itself, you'll get notified of those via GitHub's notification mechanism. Ideas for future sessions. We don't have to just have community calls. As I said, we could break this out into smaller sessions, and we're very happy to do that. For example, maybe folks are interested in hearing what exactly do you mean by V1 and a compatibility guarantee. We could have a session where we talk about that in more detail. Or we could talk in more detail about the Q proposal process, what that actually means. How do we go from like idea to design to proposal to implementation? We could do a session looking at Q issue management, how we triage, reduce problems, how folks in the community might want to help with that side of things, because it's a great way to get involved in Q itself. And contributor calls, a number of open source projects just have open contributor calls where it's like office hours for those people who want to contribute to the project in some way, shape or form. We'd also be super happy to do something like that as well. We have just created a shared calendar for Q community events. We will publish that somewhere. I think somebody asked a question in the discussion for this community call. There's a link in there if you want to dig in and find it. Otherwise, we will tweet out a link so that folks can easily add that, subscribe to that calendar for future events as well. It goes without saying that if people would like to see other things on this list for other types of sessions, please let us know. Just a quick call for feedback as well. Maybe what we're also interested in is what you are working on from a Q perspective as well. There are some absolutely fascinating projects out there that are using Q, everything from network automation using Q to at the other end of the spectrum, modeling the US tax return system using Q. Now, these are just like wildly different, and I would never have imagined the latter of those to be like a valid use case. Well, it's definitely a valid use case, but one that would come so early. So please share what it is you're working on with Q or using Q for, and include at Q_Lang as the Twitter handle, and we will retweet with our community hashtag so that we can share amongst the community a bit more of what people are actually working on using Q. We'd also love feedback as well. What would you like to see more of, less of, and where would you like there to be more of a focus? We're aware that this session has been sort of a bit more of a broadcast presentation today, and as I said, later calls will actually be more interactive, but sort of necessarily there was some project updates today. So please let us know either via our public channels or privately if you'd like to share something more discreetly. We'd love to hear from you, and yeah. Any feedback is good feedback from our perspective, positive or negative. Thank you. So the Q website at the moment has a very small number of companies, projects that are using Q. And we're acutely aware that this list is now significantly larger than that. And so this page, our homepage, is desperately in need of an update. So if your company or project is using Q and would like to appear in that list, please let us know, and we can start the process, because sometimes if there's a company or project involved, there are some necessary legals to getting sign off, etc. So please let us know, and your company project can actually appear here as well. With that, we are done on the sort of presentation side of things. So thank you for bearing with us. We're now just going to open up. So I think at this point, Daniel, I don't know how you want to try, how you suggest we would run it at this point, whether we just open it up. I've got a few suggested conversation starters here, but it looked like, I want to have a look, that there are a number of questions coming through. So I'm happy if we actually want to start going through those questions that people have shared in the chat.
Yeah, I would say we should go through the existing questions first, and then we can allow people to turn on their mics and raise their hands and so on.
Sounds good. Where is the best place to see this? Is it just in the chat? Is that where we are?
So it's in the QI section on the site. So I'll just read them out. So the first unanswered question chronologically is, can you add any detail in terms of the current status of the function signature proposal?
I think I actually answered most of that in my update, so maybe we can mark that as answered.
Okay. Marked as answered. The next one is anonymous. I wonder if there will be support for reflection on types, in particular definitions, either in Q itself or in the Go API.
Yeah, so I'll take that. So so Q, the way it's defined, and like with types being values, of course, like reflection is quite a natural thing, but I realize that in some cases, like, querying, for example, is this type an integer of type integer is not that easy, but we really should make that easier. But so I haven't really had many people or at all like having this feature. So what would be really useful here is if people can come with a concrete example of how they would want to use this, because in general, we don't really like adding features if there hasn't been a concrete demand for it, because always if you have a concrete case, it's much easier to ground your design in that and make sure that you're not missing something, have something nice. So by all means, if this is something you need, let us know, right? But it shouldn't be too hard to do that kind of stuff.
And the last written question is by Jonathan, and it goes, what's the commercial setup that's now enabling more folks to be working full-time on Q, and what are the mid and long-term implications of this?
Sure, I can take that, but Marcel, feel free to chime in on this one. Yeah, there is investment behind the Q project now. The important thing from the Q project's perspective is that is focused on the open source project itself. So for everyone on this call, I think that's the key takeaway, is that that's allowing the open source project to grow and for Q to sort of reach more users. And fundamentally, from like an ecosystem perspective, that's also the key thing as well, is that for any company or project that uses Q to succeed, it needs a very large Q ecosystem. And so that investment is obviously incredibly welcomed, because obviously it gives us the ability to have more full-time contributors to Q, but also hopefully provides people support, encouragement that actually Q has got a strong future ahead of it as well. So that's one of the reasons why we're communicating more, is we want to share the progress we're making on the Q project more, and actually build a stronger and wider Q community as well, so that ecosystem can be as strong as possible. So yeah, that's hopefully, Jonathan, that goes some way to answering your question. But please shout if not, and we can sort of follow up in a future call.
We've got one more question, but I think at this point we should just turn on the mics. And I would say we can probably do without raising hands for now and see how that goes. The only thing I would ask is that if anybody asks a question, don't hold the mic for too long. I would say maximum 1 minute. So I believe the first one should be...
we have a question from George as well, yeah.
Yeah, so Georges, just go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, so after this Jumbo 0.5 release, will you be like doing a leaner releases more frequently, or like will it be more predictable, I suppose?
Well, so I can take that. So predictable, I think no. But as Paul already mentioned, so really what we want to do is to be able to do releases on a more like topic base. So for example, the next one would be, or one of the next ones would be really focused. So we have one on some performance issues, tackling those, which would, might change some of the behavior unexpectedly, but also, for example, the definitions, right? Allowing that in closed structs. Right now, that's a bug according to the spec, but it's allowed now. So rather than just fixing the bug, which is a few lines, right, we want to be able to give people the opportunity to refactor and provide some tooling around that, because even though it's a bug, we realize that fixing that might break a lot of people. So that would be in the release in itself, right? So that basically any release increases more, where there's a higher risk of breaking things potentially, or where things might expect to be somewhat different, right? Like even if it's a bug fix. So right now, with the comprehensions and cycle fixes, so this is part of it, right? Like the comprehension behavior is much more nailed down. So this was a huge change, right? With lots of implications, like lots of rewrites. So that's a release by itself, but like a next change, like the definition one is much tinier, right? It's a few lines change. So that could be in a new release quite quickly. So it will be unpredictable, but there is some system behind it at least. So but yeah, we'll be tagging, we have the milestones in the GitHub repo with features in it. So it's a little bit somewhat chaotic right now. We will get some more structure into that we know, like when will be released what.
I
So
was going to say that's the only thing I was going to add is that really for these community calls, we want to keep the sort of the announcement part as short as possible. But one thing I think we should do on a monthly basis is talk about releases that have just happened and upcoming releases as well. So as part of improving our issue management, as Marcel said, we will start to organize releases that are coming as milestones. And so then the call itself should just be we've just updated these milestones. Please see the issues were in it. And really, it should just be an opportunity for people to discuss any questions, because really those milestones should be self-describing at that point. So George, that would hopefully give you the kind of the visibility you want on upcoming releases. We'll just get better at creating those milestones and adhering to putting issues or whatever within them.
Yeah, I get it's less of an emphasis on timeline and more on like what's next.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the milestones should cover that. And if they're not, please let us know. That they should capture what it is we're aiming to put in specific releases.
Thank you.
Thank you. Open mic for any, please. Steve Harris.
Hi. Are there coming changes to the subcommands for the Q tool? I ask out of interest because I maintain a set of Bazel rules that wraps Q to do certain things, and if say the flags were changing or the subcommands were changing, a lot could break there.
So this is Q command or the Q command or the Q subcommand?
I'm sorry, the Q tool itself, so things like QDef, QVet, Qimport, QExport, things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is also where compatibility is important. I mean, if I would say V1 compatibility guarantee, it's language is most important, then API, then tooling, but still we don't intend to just break things. What we rather do, so for example, there's a lot of things wrong with the Q command, or like wrong things we would have liked to do differently. So rather than fixing that and breaking that, the idea is that we collect all this and basically introduce a new command like QRun, either as a separate binary or not, where we address all these things, and then just deprecate Q command. It will just stay there, keeps working with the old semantics, but so this is generally how we want to do things. So similarly, I expect QDef and QExport to more or less remain as they are, maybe with more features. So we have the self-contained thing implemented now, which improves. I mean, before it could actually print wrong, not wrong, but incomplete definitions. So that's a strict improvement. But For example, QEval really doesn't make much sense, right? It prints sort of something that's in between a definition and a value. It doesn't really mean anything. So that's the idea there is to deprecate it at some point, maybe in favor of something else, which makes more sense. But we don't want to like change something existing and evolve it in breaking ways, right? Rather having new commands to supplant it. That makes sense.
Thank you.
Any other takers?
I was just going to comment on the QEval. It's nice that it you can see like partial evaluation of values, and we kind of use that.
Yeah, so that was the original idea behind it, right? But then of course it developed in this evolved in this very unprincipled thing. So it would be very good to get sort of requirements or desires, like, okay, how should the eval equivalent really look like, right? Like what should it really be? Because I understand that the partial evaluation can be quite useful, right? But how is that then different from def, for instance? So this is it would be good to know, like what would be useful.
Again, in these situations, we'll look to do is, excuse me, have issues that capture all of this. So even if it's a proposal that somebody has or an idea, we should just have issues or discussions where we can kick these ideas around, because capturing it is part of the problem, right? Is that Slack is a good place to have sort of interactive discussion, or for example, just take this Google Meet, for example. We don't want to lose that information. We definitely want to capture it afterwards. So whatever ideas people have. I don't know who was next. I think Jonathan was, sorry, Stephen, beg your pardon.
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan just asked a question. I don't know if you still have a question, Jonathan, or that hands can be lowered.
Oh no, Jonathan didn't ask one yet, I don't think.
Oh, not yet. Okay.
In the Q&A, but not in the not in the.
Oh, okay. So all right.
I just wanted to ask of the folks who are doing stuff in their sort of onboarding new users. I was wondering if there's anybody who's got a particular focus on folks more in the sort of the ops community, the folks who are least likely to reach for a code first solution and more likely to reach for who one might want to help not reach for something like JQ, etc. Is there anyone in terms of the content generation and writing things in that space with whom one should perhaps could sort of reach out and start to engage?
I could take that. That would be me, Jonathan. And we will be talking a little bit more in detail about how to get involved, how you would want to give us the feedback that you need, for the people who consider themselves in that ops group and the sort of living in a less YAML world. So look in that new discussion that was in GitHub, and then we will start joining and doing content and documentation calls on a regular basis so that we can grow exactly that kind of content.
Steve.
Hey, this is not about tools or anything, it's just a language. Something that comes up surprisingly often is we wish to be able to, within a list, refer to something about let's say a preceding element of the list. So define the first item, and then let's say in the second item, we really wish we could have put an alias next to the first item, or a let expression, something like that, so that we need a scope there where we can define something that's going to be common. Is there anything like that we've held back on making possible but is in the works?
Yeah, so I'll answer that. So one of the things I'm using the language guide for that I'm writing is to sort of test out new features as well. So for example, it's all written with a new required field proposal in mind and all that stuff, right? To see if it actually writes better, and it actually improves the documentation a lot. I think the required fields proposal. So that's nice. So one of the things, one example in there is actually a list where I do open list x equals 1, x, x. So that's something that you would want. So probably. So this basically is a value alias, right? So one of the reasons we don't have value aliases yet is because so the current let expression used to be, the syntax for it used to be what would be a value alias, right? So we have this very long deprecation process and rewriting, like Q has been rewriting these value aliases, these particular ones, to let expressions for a very long time now. So we plan to very soon like completely disable this, right? So probably in 0.5 already, that it doesn't even work anymore, right? Like the old value aliases. And then we can start introducing value aliases as is. And it didn't, I mean, we could have introduced that for lists already ahead of time, right? Because that's not ambiguous there, but it was maybe a bit strange to introduce it for lists and not the actual thing, or like for structs, right? But I have you know, I have an initial implementation of it. It's not quite done yet, but that would do something like that, yeah. But good to know that people. I mean, I have needed it many times, but good to know that other people need it too.
It reminds me, because there was a time when I think let expressions in comprehensions were threatened but not there, and then they arrived. You know, it was just not quite ready. So that's kind of what I was hoping for here.
Yeah.
We have another question that came in the chat around the use of Q, or being able to validate Q or do things with Q from other languages other than Go. That's different to the WASM implementation that Aram is talking about. And it is a good example of something where, for example, and I gave an example where someone who's writing Ruby code, for example, might want to validate some payload using Q. That is a good example of where we would love to get more details from people on exactly what they're trying to do in that situation. There are a number of approaches we could take to, for example, wrapping the Q API, the Go API, excuse me, with C wrappers, or whatever the implementation might look like. But that's exactly the approach we take there is going to be driven by use cases. So if people do have use cases, however small and concrete they might be, that's absolutely great. We can then start to flesh that out. And if actually we need to place more of a focus on that in the shorter term, we can certainly revisit that. But please, let me just make sure there is, I'll have this as a to-do for myself, that there is an issue that people can subscribe to and provide detail on. But use cases and that would be fantastic, please, because that will help us to establish what the API should look like around that as well.
Please also, if anyone knows, because most of us have experience only with the Go in terms of idiomatic APIs and things like that. If, for example, if we expose like a Ruby API or something, we would like to see from the community how such an idiomatic API would look like, so we could do it properly. Ciprian?
Yeah, hello. I was the one that was asking about using. So the simplest use case would be you use Q as a configuration language and you just need the JSON output. So
yep,
this would be the trivial, the most simple use case. And how would you do it today, for example, if you would need to integrate Q?
Yeah, so in that situation, whatever the language might be, and I see Roger's hand up as well, there are a number of ways in which we could wrap the existing Go implementation. It's more, I think the focus, we could certainly experiment with things, and indeed others could experiment with things, for example, with like a C wrapper around the Go implementation, and then exposing that to, for example, in Python would be relatively straightforward. I assume the same would be true in Ruby as well. But the critical point, as Aram said, is what does that API look like? So we can understand then, okay, how would we maintain such an ecosystem of implementations?
And the other thing I'd say that is that output is one thing, but input is also crucial, right? So you know, we can have that JSON output, but somehow you've got to feed the values from your language into Q itself and into the unification. And the Go API has quite a rich system for doing that with the, you know, the encode and the fill path things, but that's not trivial, you know, and that's quite language specific. So, and that's a significant part of any Q API, I'd say.
George, you've patiently had your hand up.
No worries, thank you for allowing me to go again. Marcel mentioned that there's going to be some sort of profiling being done on how the unifications performing for various queue use cases. Will we be able to access this? Like, will the end user have access to something like pprof for queue, where we can see the counts of like unification steps and whatnot?
Yeah, the idea is to do that indeed. It would be quite easy now to expose this in the tool already. So the queue command line, it's exposed. That's not done yet, but if there's a demand for it, we could definitely do that. We probably will anyway. Demand would probably come from ourselves. We have exposed it in tools flow at the moment, and this has already been proven quite useful. We've caught some very tiny performance bugs very early on as a result of that. It's in the test suite already. And it's a little bit harder to expose it in the API because internally in Q we have this context of a operation context, but that doesn't really exist in the API. So you need to make sure that all the operations you do use the same context, and right now that's a little bit hard to do. So, but yeah, we have some. Yeah, that would be quite an API addition basically to support that. But at least at the tooling level and in the tools flow, it's a possibility.
Yeah, the kind of, it was slightly a leading question. The context being that, like, if I want to use Q as an evaluator in my program, like I want to evaluate Q to calculate the fee for some product or whatever, and that over time becomes slow because it's evolved, someone's added complexity to it. Being able to pinpoint what is slowing it down beyond just sort of measuring on the outside of that evaluation, but being able to pinpoint will be valuable.
Yeah, we also plan to integrate this into Unity, right? So that basically if you register your repo into Unity and the newer release basically breaks some of the performance statistics, you know, we'll immediately detect it basically because of the, yeah, so that will help too. But of course I can understand that people want to have their own control over that. But we'll look how to expose it in the API. It's a bit tricky though to do it in generally.
Cool.
Tony.
Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on some of these scoping ideas. I know at one point there was talk about providing some way to get access to the root scope. And I think another use case that I've had is, you know, when you queue export, you can also, in addition to queue files, supply more traditional data files like JSON or YAML. And they're kind of brought into the scope at the root of the instance. And if there was a way we could specify, I want to put this JSON file at this particular location.
Yeah. So so accessing the root scope in its like as a direct feature of the language, like some query languages do, like, you know, $. That's not gonna happen. First of all, it would be a separate language feature, and second of all, it encourages bad behavior because absolute paths usually are not good. However, having said that, with value aliases, it's trivially doable, right? Because you can just embed a value. You can say x equals underscore, for example, at the top level, and then you would have an alias to the root of the file. So the difference with supporting $, it's like one less thing to learn, and also you encourage people to you know, to bring the alias as close to where you need it as possible, which is proper style, basically.
The second part of your question, Tony, was about, I think, what we referred to in the deck earlier on as the embed side of things. Marcel, I don't know whether you wanted to talk about that. As I said, that's something that might well build on top of decisions we make on the package management side of things. It's not a current focus in terms of us implementing anything, Tony, but we certainly love to entertain, and we were exchanging some ideas earlier on with somebody about what that might look like. So again, use cases for that, because for example, if you want to embed something that comes from a package that is a dependency, that's an interesting use case as well. How would that work? And that have clearly built on top of the package management side of things.
Yeah, so just in general, if you look at the usability of Q in certain cases, like if everything is Q native, it's easy often, right? But if you, for example, have a mix of YAML and JSON files, in a setup that's a use case you want to support better. So in general, if you take a bird's eye view on Q, you can really see, or a proper way to think of Q is that you have all these elements of configuration, data, policy, types that all fit in a certain namespace at a certain position. And the way you do that in Q is that you just have this path leading up, and then you define it, and then you unify everything together. But I can imagine that if you have a mixed environment, it would be very handy if you can just have a JSON file that gets automatically jammed into this particular part in the namespace in a convenient way, right? Like back and forth, and having a good UX around that, I think is important for having a gradual transition to Q, right? For people who are having a mixed environment. So that's something we're thinking about as well. I don't know if that's sort of, is roughly what you're talking about, but if you have any ideas there, that would be very useful.
Yeah, we've got a queue that transforms data, and we want to we get it from an API, from the cloud provider, and we want to be able to put it someplace predictable, but not at the root, because that interferes with other values we want to work with. And think about the embedding. We don't always know what I guess I don't know. Would we have to have predictable file names, or can we maybe more ad hoc?
The idea should be would be quite flexible.
Go back and forth on a discussion.
Yeah, that
sounds great. Yeah,
let's do that.
Particularly, Tony, because it sounds like you've got a specific use case, which is perfect there, because that'll help to drive the discussion on it. Thank you.
But this is coming up a lot, so this is I think an important use case.
Anybody else? Then I think we'll call that a wrap. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Great to see. I think we had around 40 odd people at one point, so thanks everyone for joining. Look forward to the next community call. As I said, that's on, and I've forgotten the date, immediately Tuesday, the 25th of October at 15:30 UTC. But again, we'll add that to the shared calendar, and we'll create a GitHub discussion to announce that with more details nearer the time. But until then, thank you very much. And as I said, please give us any feedback via any channels. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.